Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I worked two jobs to pay for my sister's education, sacrificing my own dreams so she could achieve hers. But at a family dinner, she had the audacity to call me a loser in front of everyone. That's when I decided to stop supporting her. And I made sure the entire family knew exactly why her luxurious lifestyle was about to come crashing down. It all started when Melanie, my younger sister, got the letter. The one that every high school senior dreams of, the acceptance to her dream university. She burst through the door of our modest apartment, waving it around like it was a golden ticket to a new life. I got in, she screamed, tears of joy streaming down her face. I actually got in. I hugged her tightly, genuinely thrilled for her. Melanie had always been the ambitious one, dreaming of something bigger than the small town we grew up in. But as the excitement settled, the harsh reality crept in. Tuition, housing, books. It all came with a hefty price tag. Our parents had enough trouble keeping food on the table. There was no way they could afford to help her. That night, Melanie sat at the kitchen table, staring at the acceptance letter with tear-filled eyes. "I can't go," she said softly, her voice breaking. "It's too expensive." I looked at her, my heart aching. Melanie had worked so hard for this moment, and the thought of her giving it up felt unbearable. After a long silence, I said the words that would change both of our lives. "I'll pay for it." Her head snapped up, disbelief written all over her face. "What? No, you can't do that." "I can," I insisted. "I'll pick up extra shifts and cover whatever your scholarships and loans don't." "You work too hard to give this up, Mel." She threw her arms around me, sobbing into my shoulder. "I'll never forget this," she whispered. "I owe you everything." The next 4 years were a blur of long days and sleepless nights. I took on a second job, working as a bartender after my full-time shift at a warehouse. Weekends became a haze of exhaustion as I juggled double shifts, trying to keep up with Melanie's tuition payments, textbook costs, and even some extra spending money so she could enjoy campus life. Melanie would call me occasionally, bubbling over with excitement about her classes, her new friends, and her campus adventures. "College is amazing," she'd say. "I went to this incredible seminar today, and I'm thinking of joining the debate team." Hearing the joy in her voice made it all worth it. I was proud of her, proud that my sacrifices were helping her build a future. I didn't resent the long hours or the tight budgets. I told myself it was temporary, that once Melanie graduated and found a good job, I could finally start focusing on my own life. But as time went on, cracks began to form. Melanie's calls became less frequent, and when she did call, it was usually to ask for more money. "Hey, can you send a little extra this month?" she'd say casually, as if the money was an endless resource. "I need it for a new laptop. Mine's too slow for my design class." I always said yes, though it meant cutting corners in my own life. I skipped out on vacations, nights out with friends, and even basic comforts like new clothes or better groceries. Everything went toward Melanie's future because I believed in her. I didn't realize it at the time, but something was shifting. Melanie, the grateful little sister who had promised to never forget what I'd done for her, was beginning to take my sacrifices for granted. And though I didn't know it yet, those cracks would eventually become a chasm that would change everything. 4 years of blood, sweat, and sacrifice culminated in a proud but bittersweet day, Melanie's graduation. I sat in the audience of the packed auditorium, watching her walk across the stage in her cap and gown. She looked radiant, beaming with pride as she accepted her degree. It was a moment I had dreamed of for her, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of pride knowing I had helped make it happen. Her valedictorian speech was thoughtful and eloquent. She thanked her professors for their guidance, her friends for their support, and even her classmates for the shared journey. I kept waiting for her to mention me, to acknowledge the sacrifices I'd made to get her here. But she never did. As the ceremony ended, families swarmed the graduates with hugs and congratulations. Melanie ran toward me, her arms open wide. "I did it," she said, wrapping me in a tight hug. "You did," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm proud of you, Mel." We took pictures, laughed, and celebrated with our family. But a part of me couldn't shake the sting of her omission. I brushed it off, telling myself that she was caught up in the excitement of the day. Surely, she'd find a moment later to thank me privately. That moment never came. A few weeks later, Melanie landed her dream job, a high-paying position in marketing at a well-known company. "This is it," she said over the phone. "I'm finally on my way to the life I've always wanted." I was thrilled for her. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. the payoff for all the sacrifices I'd made. She would be independent now, free to chase her dreams, and I could finally start focusing on my own life. But instead of easing into financial responsibility, Melanie dove headfirst into a lifestyle she couldn't afford. She moved into a high-end apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and a concierge service. Her social media became a highlight reel of luxury: designer clothes, expensive dinners, and weekend getaways to exotic locations. At first, I didn't say anything. She deserved to enjoy the fruits of her hard work. But when the calls started coming, I realized something was wrong. "Hey," Melanie said one evening, her voice tinged with panic. "I hate to ask, but could you help me out with rent this month? It's just until I get everything settled. You know, first job struggles." I hesitated, but I didn't want to see her struggle after everything she'd accomplished. "Sure," I said, "but just this once, okay?" "Of course," she promised. "You're the best." That "just this once" quickly turned into a pattern. Every few months, Melanie would call with another financial emergency: an overdue utility bill, a car payment, a last-minute trip she couldn't miss. Each time, she assured me it was temporary, that she'd pay me back soon. A year went by, and nothing changed. Melanie showed no signs of cutting back on her lavish lifestyle. She was still living in her luxury apartment, still posting pictures of her designer bags and exotic vacations, and still turning to me whenever her paycheck couldn't cover her expenses. It was frustrating, but I kept helping her. I told myself that she just needed time to adjust to adulthood, that this was a phase she'd grow out of. After all, I was her big sibling. It was my job to support her, right? But as the months dragged on, I started to feel less like a supportive sibling and more like an aim. Melanie's gratitude seemed to fade with each passing favor, replaced by an unsettling sense of entitlement. One night, after wiring her rent money for the third time that year, I stared at my bank statement and realized something had to change. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own financial stability to prop up her unsustainable lifestyle. But I didn't say anything. Not yet. I kept telling myself she'd figure it out on her own, that this was just another rough patch. I didn't know it at the time, but my breaking point was closer than I thought. It was supposed to be a celebration. My parents had invited everyone over for dinner, excited to catch up as a family. Melanie had just come back from another one of her business trips to Europe, and my parents couldn't stop talking about how proud they were of her. As we gathered around the table, the conversation turned to Melanie's glamorous lifestyle. "So, how do you manage it all?" my aunt asked, gesturing to the photos Melanie had been showing off: Parisian cafes, luxury handbags, and five-star hotels. Melanie leaned back in her chair, her lips curling into a smug smile. "Oh, you know," she said, twirling her wine glass, "I just worked hard and made good choices." Her words hit me like a slap in the face. I set down my fork, my appetite suddenly gone. "Good choices?" I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "What about all the help you've had?" Melanie's eyes flicked to me, her smile tightening. "What help? You mean from you?" she added, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Come on, it's not like you've done that much." The room grew quiet, the cheerful chatter replaced by an uneasy tension. My mom glanced between us, her expression confused. "What are you talking about?" she asked. Melanie shrugged, clearly enjoying the attention. "Oh, they're just being dramatic," she said. "Probably jealous because I've actually made something of myself, while they're still stuck working 2 jobs in some dead-end career." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Her words hung in the air, venomous and cutting. I looked around the table, expecting someone to say something, to defend me, but everyone was too stunned to react. "You've got some nerve," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "Do you think your success just appeared out of thin air? Do you know how many sleepless nights I've spent working 2 jobs so you could go to that fancy school? Or how many times I've bailed you out when your expensive lifestyle didn't match your paycheck?" Melanie's smug expression faltered, but only for a moment. "Oh, please," she said, rolling her eyes. "Don't act like I owe you my life. I would have figured it out eventually." "You didn't figure it out, Melanie," I snapped. "You relied on me, and I was happy to help. But calling me a loser after everything I've done for you? That's too far." The room was silent, save for the sound of my dad awkwardly clearing his throat. Melanie crossed her arms, refusing to back down. "Well, maybe if you weren't so bitter and stuck in the past, you'd have a better life too." That was it. I stood up, pushing my chair back with more force than I intended. "You want to act like you did it all on your own? Fine. Let's see how far you get without me." "What's that supposed to mean?" Melanie asked, her voice suddenly uncertain. "It means I'm done," I said, looking her directly in the eye. "No more rent, no more handouts, no more covering for you when you overspend. If you're so successful, you can figure it out on your own. Melanie's face turned red, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to come up with a response. My parents and the rest of the family sat frozen, too shocked to intervene. I didn't wait for her to recover. I grabbed my things and walked out of the house, my heart pounding and my mind racing. That night, I couldn't sleep. Part of me felt guilty for causing a scene, but another part of me knew it had been a long time coming. I had spent years sacrificing for Melanie, bending over backward to support her, only to have her throw it all back in my face. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I couldn't keep enabling her behavior. If she wanted to live like she was self-made, then it was time for her to face the reality of what that actually meant. Little did Melanie know, her life was about to change, and not in the way she expected. Her words hit me harder than I thought they would. Loser, that single word, said so carelessly, cut through me like a knife. I had sacrificed so much for Melanie. Years of working 2 jobs, missing out on opportunities for myself, and putting my own dreams on hold to support hers. And this was my reward? Public humiliation at the hands of the person I'd given everything to? My heart pounded as I stood up, my hands trembling with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. The room seemed to shrink around me, the weight of her words pressing down on my chest. You think I'm a loser, Melanie? I said, my voice louder than I intended. Fine, let's see how well you do without me. Her smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. I turned to the rest of the family, my frustration boiling over. Since Melanie wants to pretend she's done it all on her own, let me set the record straight. I've been paying her rent for over a year, just like I paid for her education. Without me, she wouldn't have half of what she has now. The room fell into a stunned silence. My mom looked at me, her eyes wide with confusion. What do you mean you've been paying her rent? I mean exactly what I said, I replied, my gaze fixed on Melanie. She's been living in that fancy apartment because I've been covering the shortfall every month. And let's not forget the years I worked 2 jobs to pay for her tuition, her textbooks, and even her spending money so she could enjoy college life without a care in the world. Melanie's face turned bright red, her composure slipping. That's not true, she stammered. You're exaggerating. I never asked for any of that. I let out a bitter laugh. Oh, really? You didn't ask for help when you called me crying about your tuition? Or when you begged me to cover your rent because you just needed a little help to get settled? You didn't seem to have a problem asking then. The tension in the room was palpable. My dad cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Is this true, Melanie? She fidgeted with her napkin, avoiding his gaze. I mean, I guess they helped a little, but it's not like I relied on them for everything. I worked hard for what I have. I shook my head, incredulous. You worked hard? Melanie, you've been living a lifestyle you can't afford because you knew I'd bail you out whenever things got tight. And now you have the audacity to call me a loser? After everything I've done for you? The family sat frozen, caught between shock and discomfort. My mom finally spoke up, her voice shaking. Melanie, is this true? Did they pay for your education? Your rent? Melanie opened her mouth to respond, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, she crossed her arms and glared at me. Why are you bringing this up now? What? You want everyone to feel sorry for you? No, Melanie, I said, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. I don't want pity. I want respect, something you clearly don't have for me, despite everything I've done for you. The silence that followed was deafening. My aunt looked down at her plate, avoiding eye contact, while my dad exchanged a worried glance with my mom. Melanie, still red-faced, refused to meet my eyes. Here's the deal, I said, breaking the silence. Since you think you've done it all on your own, I'm going to give you the chance to prove it. I'm done. No more rent payments, no more financial bailouts, no more anything. You're on your own now, Melanie. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. You can't do that, she blurted out. I'll lose my apartment. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you called me a loser, I said coldly. Actions have consequences, Melanie. It's time you learned that. Without waiting for a response, I grabbed my coat and walked out, leaving the stunned silence of the dining room behind me. As I drove home, my emotions swirled, anger, sadness, and a strange sense of relief. For years, I had carried the weight of Melanie's success on my shoulders, sacrificing my own happiness to ensure hers. But that night, I realized something. I couldn't keep enabling her. She needed to face the reality of her choices, and I needed to reclaim my life. Melanie didn't know it yet, but her comfortable, consequence-free lifestyle was about to come crashing down. And this time, I wouldn't be there to pick up the pieces. When I got home that night, the weight of the family dinner still clung to me. Melanie's words replayed in my mind like a broken record, her sneering tone cutting deeper every time. After everything I'd done for her, she had the nerve to belittle me in front of our entire family. It was the final straw, and as I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my bank statement, I realized something needed to change. I had been Melanie's safety net for far too long. Every time she overspent or found herself in a bind, she knew she could count on me to bail her out. But that was over. I was done sacrificing my own happiness, my own dreams, just to fund her lifestyle. She needed to learn what it meant to stand on her own 2 feet, and I needed to reclaim my life. That night, I made the hardest decision I'd ever had to make. I was cutting her off. The next morning, I called Melanie. She answered on the third ring, her voice chipper. "Hey, what's up?" I didn't waste any time. "Melanie, we need to talk," I said, my tone firm. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened last night." Her tone immediately shifted, growing defensive. "Oh, come on. Are you seriously still upset about that? You were being dramatic and I just said some stuff. It's not that big of a deal." "It is a big deal, Melanie," I replied. "What you said was disrespectful and hurtful, and it made me realize something. I can't keep enabling you. I'm not paying your rent anymore." There was a pause, and then her voice exploded through the phone. "What? You can't just stop helping me. I'll lose my apartment." "Then maybe you should have thought about that before you called me a loser," I said calmly. "You're really going to throw that in my face?" she snapped. "After everything we've been through? You're just going to abandon me like this?" "I'm not abandoning you, Melanie. I'm teaching you a lesson. You've taken me for granted for years, and last night proved that you don't respect me or appreciate what I've done for you. If you want to live this lifestyle, then you need to pay for it yourself." "But I can't afford it," she wailed. "You know I can't? Then maybe it's time to make some changes," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "Cut back on your spending. Move into a smaller apartment. Get a roommate. Figure it out, Melanie, because I'm done." Her tone shifted again, this time to desperation. "Please, I'll do better," she pleaded. "I'll be more careful with money. Just help me out this one last time, and I promise I'll change." I sighed, my heart aching despite my resolve. "Melanie, I've been hearing just one last time for years. It's never the last time. This isn't about me helping you. It's about you learning to take responsibility for your own life." Her voice cracked. "I don't know what to do," she said, barely above a whisper. "You'll figure it out," I said gently. "You're smart, Melanie. You're capable. But you need to stop relying on me to fix everything for you. It's time to grow up." When I hung up, I felt a mix of relief and guilt. Part of me hated the thought of Melanie struggling, but another part knew it was necessary. For too long, I had been her crutch, and it had done neither of us any favors. That afternoon, I called the landlord of her building to confirm that my name had been removed from her lease. It was the final step in cutting the financial ties that had tethered us for years. Over the next few days, I braced myself for the fallout. Melanie called me several times, leaving tearful voicemails and sending long, guilt-laden texts. When those didn't work, she tried anger, accusing me of being selfish and cruel. But I didn't waver. For the first time in years, I put my foot down and chose to prioritize myself. It wasn't just about the money. It was about respect. Melanie needed to understand that actions have consequences, and I needed to reclaim my own sense of worth. For years, I had sacrificed for her, but it was time for me to start living for myself. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. Melanie's comfortable, consequence-free lifestyle was over. And as hard as it was to cut her off, I knew it was the right thing to do for both of us. As expected, Melanie didn't handle my decision well. For someone who had always lived in the comfort of my sacrifices, the idea of suddenly standing on her own 2 feet was apparently unfathomable. The phone call started the next day. Endless rings at all hours, ranging from tearful begging to outright fury. "You're ruining my life," she screamed in one voicemail. "How could you do this to me? I thought we were family." When I didn't respond to her increasingly frantic messages, she turned to our parents, framing herself as the victim. I got a call from my mom later that evening, her voice full of concern. "Why would you cut Melanie off like this? She says she's going to lose her apartment." I sighed, bracing myself for the conversation I'd been dreading. "Mom, you don't know the whole story. Let me explain." Sitting in my small living room, I told my parents everything. About how I'd worked 2 jobs to pay for Melanie's education, about the countless times I'd bailed her out financially, and about the family dinner where she'd humiliated me in front of everyone. My mom listened in silence, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something resembling guilt. When I was done, she leaned back in her chair, letting out a heavy sigh. "I had no idea," she said softly. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" "I didn't want to make a big deal out of it," I admitted. "I thought I was doing the right thing by helping her. But it's gone too far, and I can't do it anymore. She needs to take responsibility for her own life." To my surprise, my dad chimed in, his tone firm. "You're absolutely right. She's been taking advantage of you for years. She needs to grow up and learn some responsibility." Hearing those words from my dad was a relief I hadn't realized I needed. He wasn't usually the type to take sides, but his support felt like validation after years of feeling like my sacrifices had gone unnoticed. "Thanks, Dad," I said quietly. My mom, though more hesitant, nodded in agreement. "She's going to be upset, but maybe this is what she needs to wake up." Of course, Melanie didn't see it that way. When she realized she wasn't getting the reaction she wanted from our parents, she turned to the rest of the family, spinning a sob story about how I had abandoned her out of spite. For weeks, I fielded calls and messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins, all asking the same question. "What's going on with you and Melanie?" At first, I tried to be diplomatic, giving a brief explanation of the situation without going into too much detail. But as the calls kept coming, I realized I needed to set the record straight. During a family Zoom call that Melanie conveniently skipped, I laid it all out. "I love my sister," I began, "but I've been enabling her for too long. I worked 2 jobs to pay for her education, covered her rent when she couldn't afford it, and sacrificed my own dreams so she could chase hers. And last month, she called me a loser in front of everyone at dinner." The room fell silent. Some faces looked shocked, others uncomfortable. My aunt finally broke the silence, saying, "I had no idea you'd done so much for her." "Neither did we," my mom added. The fallout didn't stop there. Melanie, oblivious to how much of the truth I had shared, continued her usual routine of posting glamorous photos on social media. But without my financial support, cracks in her facade started to show. She posted less frequently, and when she did, the content was noticeably more subdued. No more fancy dinners or weekend getaways, just vague quotes about hard times and learning lessons. Eventually, the truth became impossible for her to hide. She had to move out of her luxury apartment and into a much smaller place in a less desirable part of town. She sold off some of her designer bags and shoes, trying to scrape together enough money to cover her expenses. For a while, I felt a twinge of guilt watching her struggle. But I reminded myself that this was the lesson she needed. Melanie had been living in a bubble, shielded from the consequences of her own actions, and bursting that bubble was the only way she would ever grow. My parents checked in with her regularly, offering emotional support but refusing to give her money. "We're not going to undo what you're trying to teach her," my dad assured me. "She's old enough to figure it out on her own," and figure it out she did, though not without plenty of resistance. The fallout wasn't just about Melanie's finances. It was about her entire outlook on life. For the first time, she was facing the reality of what it meant to be truly independent. It wasn't pretty, but it was necessary. And as hard as it was to watch her stumble, I knew it was the only way she would ever learn to stand on her own. The shift in Melanie's life was almost immediate. Without my financial support to prop up her lifestyle, the reality of her situation hit her like a freight train. Within weeks, the cracks began to show. Her once luxurious apartment, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and concierge service, was no longer affordable. She scrambled to keep up with the rent, but it became clear that her paycheck alone couldn't cover it. The first sign of her downfall appeared on social media. Melanie, who used to post endless photos of fancy dinners and designer outfits, suddenly went silent. When she did post, it was noticeably more muted. A picture of her coffee table with a caption about staying grounded or a vague quote about starting over. I heard through our parents that she was moving out of her apartment. "She's not happy about it," my mom said over the phone. "She says she feels humiliated." "Good," I replied, not out of spite, but because I knew this was a necessary step. Melanie had been living in a bubble, and it was time for her to face the real world. Her new apartment was a far cry from her old one. It was a small, no-frills one-bedroom in a less glamorous part of town. Gone were the concierge service and the city views, replaced by creaky floors and a street-level window that rattled in the wind. She tried to maintain her image at first, pretending that the move was her choice, a simpler lifestyle she had always wanted. But the facade didn't last long. Soon after, I started hearing from mutual friends that she was selling off her designer handbags and high-end clothes. "She's trying to cover her bills," one friend said. "It's sad, really. She loved those bags." I resisted the urge to say she loved spending other people's money on those bags. Instead, I stayed quiet, knowing that this was the reality Melanie desperately needed. At first, she was furious. I received a string of angry texts accusing me of ruining her life. "You didn't have to do this," one message read. "If you hadn't cut me off, I wouldn't be in this mess." Another said, "You're the reason I'm struggling right now. How could you do this to me?" I didn't respond. I'd already said my piece, and engaging in her blame game wouldn't help either of us. Still, it hurt to see her lash out, knowing that she wasn't ready to take responsibility for her choices. But over time, something shifted. The texts stopped coming, and the updates I heard from our parents began to change. Melanie had started budgeting, learning to live within her means for the first time in her life. She was cutting back on unnecessary expenses, cooking at home instead of eating out, and using public transportation instead of relying on ride shares. She even picked up a part-time job on weekends, something she'd never done before. "She says it's temporary," my mom said during one of our calls, "but I think it's good for her. She's learning how hard it is to make ends meet." Hearing about her progress was both a relief and a bittersweet reminder of everything it had taken to get her to this point. One day, I got an unexpected text from her. "Hey, just wanted to say I'm sorry for being so angry at you. I know you were just trying to teach me a lesson." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "I wasn't trying to teach you a lesson, Melanie. I just couldn't keep enabling you. I'm glad you're figuring things out." Her response was immediate. "It's hard, but I'm trying. Thanks for helping me see that I needed to change." Watching Melanie slowly rebuild her life was both satisfying and heartbreaking. It was satisfying to see her take control of her own future, to watch her grow into someone who could stand on her own. But it was also a reminder of how far we drifted, how much damage had been done to our relationship in the process. Still, I knew that this transformation was necessary. For the first time, Melanie was living within her means, working hard, and taking responsibility for her choices. She wasn't the same entitled, careless person she had been just a few months ago. And as much as I wished it hadn't taken a family blowout and months of struggle to get here, I couldn't help but feel proud of her progress. It was a small but important step toward the future, for both of us. The shift in Melanie's life was almost immediate. Without my financial support to prop up her lifestyle, the reality of her situation hit her like a freight train. Within weeks, the cracks began to show. Her once luxurious apartment, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and concierge service, was no longer affordable. She scrambled to keep up with the rent, but it became clear that her paycheck alone couldn't cover it. The first sign of her downfall appeared on social media. Melanie, who used to post endless photos of fancy dinners and designer outfits, suddenly went silent. When she did post, it was noticeably more muted. A picture of her coffee table with a caption about staying grounded or a vague quote about starting over. I heard through our parents that she was moving out of her apartment. "She's not happy about it," my mom said over the phone. "She says she feels humiliated." "Good," I replied, not out of spite, but because I knew this was a necessary step. Melanie had been living in a bubble, and it was time for her to face the real world. Her new apartment was a far cry from her old one. It was a small, no-frills one-bedroom in a less glamorous part of town. Gone with the concierge service and the city views, replaced by creaky floors and a street-level window that rattled in the wind. She tried to maintain her image at first, pretending that the move was her choice, a simpler lifestyle she had always wanted. But the facade didn't last long. Soon after, I started hearing from mutual friends that she was selling off her designer handbags and high-end clothes. "She's trying to cover her bills," one friend said. "It's sad, really. She loved those bags." I resisted the urge to say she loved spending other people's money on those bags. Instead, I stayed quiet, knowing that this was the reality Melanie desperately needed. At first, she was furious. I received a string of angry texts accusing me of ruining her life. "You didn't have to do this," one message read. "If you hadn't cut me off, I wouldn't be in this mess." Another said, "You're the reason I'm struggling right now. How could you do this to me?" I didn't respond. I'd already said my piece, and engaging in her blame game wouldn't help either of us. Still, it hurt to see her lash out, knowing that she wasn't ready to take responsibility for her choices. But over time, something shifted. The texts stopped coming, and the updates I heard from our parents began to change. Melanie had started budgeting, learning to live within her means for the first time in her life. She was cutting back on unnecessary expenses, cooking at home instead of eating out, and using public transportation instead of relying on ride shares. She even picked up a part-time job on weekends, something she'd never done before. "She says it's temporary," my mom said during one of our calls, but I think it's good for her. She's learning how hard it is to make ends meet. Hearing about her progress was both a relief and a bittersweet reminder of everything it had taken to get her to this point. One day, I got an unexpected text from her. "Hey, just wanted to say I'm sorry for being so angry at you. I know you were just trying to teach me a lesson." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "I wasn't trying to teach you a lesson, Melanie. I just couldn't keep enabling you. I'm glad you're figuring things out." Her response was immediate. "It's hard, but I'm trying. Thanks for helping me see that I needed to change." Watching Melanie slowly rebuild her life was both satisfying and heartbreaking. It was satisfying to see her take control of her own future, to watch her grow into someone who could stand on her own. But it was also a reminder of how far we drifted, how much damage had been done to our relationship in the process. Still, I knew that this transformation was necessary. For the first time, Melanie was living within her means, working hard, and taking responsibility for her choices. She wasn't the same entitled, careless person she had been just a few months ago. And as much as I wished it hadn't taken a family blowout and months of struggle to get here, I couldn't help but feel proud of her progress. It was a small but important step toward the future, for both of us. Each chapter should be no less than 4,500 characters. Let's move on to the next chapter. #####, Chapter 8, The Apology. Months later, Melanie showed up at my doorstep. She looked different, humbled, tired, but genuine. "I'm sorry," she said, "for everything, for taking advantage of you, for calling you a loser, for not appreciating what you've done for me." Her apology felt sincere, but I told her it would take time to rebuild our relationship. "Words are a start, Melanie, but actions matter more," I said. ChatGPT. Chapter 8, The Apology. It had been months since the family dinner debacle and the fallout that followed. Life had finally started to feel normal again. I no longer braced myself for angry calls or guilt-laden texts from Melanie. My evenings were quieter, my budget healthier, and my mental state more peaceful than it had been in years. Still, she wasn't far from my mind. Despite everything, she was my sister, and I couldn't help but wonder how she was doing. I occasionally heard updates from my parents, how she was managing her smaller apartment, how she was working weekends to make ends meet, and how she seemed more subdued than before. So, when I heard a knock at my door one rainy Saturday morning, I wasn't entirely surprised to find Melanie standing there. What surprised me was how different she looked. Gone was the polished, self-assured sister who used to flaunt designer bags and luxury vacations. Melanie stood on my doorstep in a simple sweatshirt and jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. Her eyes, once full of confidence, now carried the weight of humility and exhaustion. "Hi," she said quietly, her voice almost drowned out by the rain. "Hi," I replied, unsure of what to expect. "Can I come in?" she asked. I hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. She walked into the living room, glancing around as if she hadn't been here in years. We sat down, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she took a deep breath and said, "I'm sorry. For everything." Her voice cracked as she continued. "For taking advantage of you, for calling you a loser, for not appreciating what you've done for me. I was awful to you, and I hate that it took losing everything to realize how much you've done for me." I studied her face, searching for any signs of insincerity, but there were none. Her apology felt genuine, raw even. It was the moment I had been waiting for, but it didn't erase the months of hurt or the years of being taken for granted. "Thank you for saying that," I said carefully. "But you need to understand something, Melanie. Words are a start, but actions matter more." "I know," she said quickly. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to tell you that I'm sorry and that I'm trying to change. I know I've got a lot of work to do, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I want you to know I mean it." We talked for hours that day. Melanie opened up about the struggles she'd faced since I cut her off, how hard it had been to adjust to a tighter budget, how embarrassed she'd felt moving out of her apartment, and how angry she'd been at me initially. "I blamed you for everything at first," she admitted, her eyes downcast. "But then I realized that it wasn't your fault. I was the one who overspent, who relied on you instead of taking responsibility. You didn't ruin my life. I did." Hearing her take accountability was both satisfying and bittersweet. I couldn't help but think about how much pain could have been avoided if she'd reached this point sooner. But I also knew that growth often came from hardship, and Melanie's journey had been no exception. As the rain let up outside, Melanie stood to leave. "Thank you for letting me come over," she said. "I don't deserve your kindness, but I'm grateful for it." I nodded, walking her to the door. "You're my sister, Melanie. That's never going to change." But rebuilding our relationship is going to take time. Trust isn't something you can fix with an apology. It's something you earn. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I understand. I just hope I can prove to you that I've changed. I hope so too, I said softly. As she stepped out into the damp street, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief, sadness, and a glimmer of hope. Melanie's apology was a step in the right direction, but it was only the beginning. Whether or not she could truly make amends remained to be seen, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like there was a chance we could move forward. The months that followed Melanie's apology were a slow but steady process of rebuilding, both for her life and for our relationship. True to her word, she began taking meaningful steps to prove she had changed. It wasn't just words anymore. She backed up her promises with actions. She stopped living beyond her means. Instead of splurging on unnecessary luxuries, she started budgeting carefully. She packed lunches instead of dining out, canceled her expensive gym membership in favor of home workouts, and resisted the temptation to buy things she didn't need. Most notably, Melanie took on a second job to pay off her debts. She worked long hours, splitting her time between her marketing job and a weekend gig at a local coffee shop. It was a far cry from the glamorous lifestyle she'd once flaunted, but she never complained about it. For the first time, she seemed to understand the value of hard work and how much I had sacrificed for her. One day, Melanie invited me over to her apartment. It was a modest space, nothing like the high-end place she used to live in, but it was tidy and well-maintained. She proudly showed me her budget spreadsheet, pointing out how much she had saved and how close she was to paying off her credit card debt. "Look," she said, beaming, "I've already paid off half of it. I should be completely debt-free by the end of the year." I couldn't help but smile. "That's impressive, Melanie. I'm proud of you." Her face lit up at my words, and for the first time in years, I saw a glimpse of the little sister I used to know, the one who wasn't defined by entitlement or arrogance, but by determination and heart. As Melanie worked to improve her life, she also made an effort to repair our relationship. She started calling and texting more often, not to ask for money, but to check in and see how I was doing. She invited me to coffee, cooked dinner for me at her apartment, and even surprised me with a small, thoughtful gift, a book she knew I'd been wanting to read. "I wanted to thank you," she said as she handed it to me, "for everything. I know I can't change the past, but I hope I can make things right moving forward." Her sincerity was undeniable, and while I still had my guard up, I could feel the walls between us slowly beginning to crumble. Despite her growth, I made it clear that I wouldn't be her safety net anymore. "You're capable of standing on your own, Melanie," I told her during one of our talks, "and I need to focus on my own life now." She nodded, her expression serious. "I understand. I don't expect you to take care of me anymore. I want to take care of myself, and I want you to do the same." Hearing those words was both liberating and bittersweet. For so long, I had been consumed by the responsibility of supporting Melanie, to the point where I had neglected my own needs and dreams. But now, for the first time, I felt like I had permission to let go. The experience changed both of us. Melanie learned the importance of accountability, humility, and hard work, while I learned the value of setting boundaries and prioritizing my own well-being. It wasn't easy to reach this point, and the scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined our relationship. Instead, they served as reminders of how far we had come and how much we had both grown. As I left Melanie's apartment that evening, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't felt in years. She was finally standing on her own, and I was finally free to focus on myself. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a hopeful one. And sometimes that's all you need. Looking back, cutting Melanie off felt like stepping off a cliff, uncertain of what would happen next. It was one of the hardest decisions I'd ever made, and for weeks, I wrestled with guilt and doubt. Was I too harsh? Could I have handled things differently? Would Melanie hate me forever for taking such a drastic stand? But as the months passed and I saw the changes in her, I realized it was also one of the best decisions I'd ever made. It forced her to grow up, to take responsibility for her own life, and to confront the consequences of her actions. And in doing so, it taught me the importance of setting boundaries and standing up for myself, even when it's uncomfortable. For years, I had let guilt and obligation drive my actions, sacrificing my own well-being to support someone who didn't appreciate it. But cutting Melanie off allowed me to reclaim my life, my time, and my sense of self-worth. Today, our relationship looks completely different from what it once was. Melanie is no longer the entitled, carefree sibling who relied on me for everything. She's someone who understands the value of hard work and the importance of gratitude. When we talk now, our conversations are filled with mutual respect and understanding. She doesn't ask for handouts or favors, and I don't feel the weight of unspoken resentment hanging over us. We've finally learned to respect each other as equals, and that has made all the difference. One afternoon, as we sat at a cafe, catching up, Melanie said something that stuck with me. I used to think you cutting me off was the worst thing that ever happened to me, she admitted. But now I realize it was the best. It made me stronger, and it made me realize how much I had been taking you for granted. Her words were sincere, and for the first time, I felt the last remnants of my resentment fade away. Would I do it all over again? Maybe. It's hard to say. I still wish things hadn't reached the point where cutting her off was necessary, but I know it was the only way to break the cycle we had fallen into. One thing's for sure, I'll never let anyone take advantage of me like that again. I've learned to recognize the signs of unhealthy relationships, to set boundaries, and to say no when I need to. Those lessons weren't easy to learn, but they've made me a stronger person. As for Melanie, I'm proud of the person she's become. She's not perfect. None of us are, but she's trying, and that's what matters. Seeing her take responsibility for her life and work to rebuild our relationship has been one of the most rewarding parts of this journey. Life isn't about avoiding mistakes. It's about learning from them. And in the end, this experience taught both of us lessons we'll carry for the rest of our lives. Now, when I look at Melanie, I don't see the entitled sibling who called me a loser. I see someone who has grown, someone who values what she has, and someone who understands the importance of respect and gratitude. And for the first time in years, I feel truly at peace.